All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the only coast to coast show all about the information economy. It's called Inside Analysis. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh, here with one of my best friends in the business, a guy who's been around for a couple of years now and has made his way into all sorts of different data scenarios, data products, data concepts, data models, data designs. Mr. Kent Graziano, I asked him before we started, does that mean does that mean thank you very much in Italian? Because of course, grazie, grazie mille, but it means grace or beloved or dear. So, Kent, dear Graziano, how's it going out there, buddy?
Good. How are you doing, Eric?
I'm doing good. So, yeah, folks, I had this idea to do a series called Profiles in Data because it's all about the people when you get right down to it. I mean, of course, the data is important and the tools and the technologies and the methods and how to do all that stuff. But at the end of the day, even in this era of AI, it's still about the people. And it's always going to be about the people. I mean, the jobs are going to change. I think we're going to go through a very disruptive period. It's already happening from what I've seen. It's already taking place. There are lots of reasons for it, but the one thing you can count on is the wisdom of sages. And so, Kent, I'm going to throw you in that category as a data sage. You've been around a long time. You've seen the ups and downs, and we're in a very different world right now. I'm going to throw kind of a curveball at you to start. I feel like these large language models represent a very serious inflection point in the history of business, quite frankly, but primarily of the data world. And I'll explain why. So, in the very earliest days of DM radio, I remember wrapping my head around ETL, all this ETL moving around and around and around and around, all these batch windows being hit. And I thought to myself, this is crazy. Like that, you're probably moving data that doesn't get used. You're probably moving the same data multiple times. You're probably sometimes overwriting good data with bad. I mean, there just must be so many things happening here on the data front, but business just demands things. The business demands data. It demands execution. It demands performance. Business people say, "Hey, we got to get our data in there." Okay, fine. Let's move it in there. Oh, we didn't get the schema right. And then things changed, right? Like with Snowflake, and you know a lot about Snowflake. Maybe we'll start there. One thing that I thought they really solved and really figured out was that schemas change because the world changes. So you want to be able to change the schema of your warehouse. Well, in the pre-Snowflake days, that was a huge problem. I mean, you'd be asking for lots of trouble, a lot of money, a lot of very unhappy engineers, like lots of bad things would happen. And Snowflake's like, now let's make it easy to pull this thing down, change the schema, and then spin it back up again. Was it your take as well? That was a very big change in the industry.
Yeah, Snowflake was to use the standard phrase, a game changer, certainly in the data warehousing world because of a number of the features that Benoit and Thierry uh, architected into the platform, right? And what you're talking about there, which made a huge difference and still obviously does to a lot of people, was their zero copy clone, the ability to take an existing schema and with one command clone the entire thing and basically make a complete replica of it with no additional storage cost. That was the thing, because that was something I couldn't do in the data warehousing world. If I wanted to have a dev instance that had the same amount of data as my prod instance, I never, ever in my career was able to get that because the cost was too much and the time. Once you started getting into terabytes of data to replicate that on storage with the systems at the time, that could take days, weeks, sometimes depending on the system, and you
Mm.
really couldn't get, which meant you couldn't actually innovate with confidence that you weren't going to break
Right.
something, right?
Right.
Because you couldn't test it. It's like, oh, the query works great. Yeah, well, you're got 1/10 of the data in your QA instance as you do in production, and then it goes to production, and the users are screaming, going, I can't live with this. This is too slow. And now you're doing, again, additional iterations and refactoring to figure out how can I tune it to make it better? How can I make it
Mm.
faster? And the users are already mad at you because you told them you had what they wanted, and they're like, well, this is unusable. It's too slow. Um, and the zero copy cloning thing, that was like, wow, this is awesome. This means I can actually not shoot myself in the foot before I move something into production and have to do these cycles again. We could do real user acceptance testing
Mm,
without this exorbitant cost or waiting weeks for the infrastructure team to put more disk online and for the DBAs to restore something from backup, assuming the backup tape was actually good.
right,
That they could
right.
do all of that. So that really did change a lot for a lot of companies out there. That and of course the whole separation of compute from storage that allowed you to scale the storage if you needed without scaling the compute and scale the compute without scaling the storage. It just made it
Hmm.
so flexible. It just changed. It changed so many things. Then you throw in the variant data type that allowed you to load JSON. So you talk about schema changes. We actually got real schema on read. You load in a
Hmm.
JSON document into a table, a relational database with a table, access it with SQL,
Right,
and as your data pipeline is running and you got new data coming in, if there's a little change in the schema, it didn't break anything. I mean, I'm sure
mm,
you remember the days that you were talking about ETL. It's like the source system changed. They dropped one column, right? And
right,
didn't tell anybody
right,
because they're thinking about their operational system. They're not thinking about the data warehouse. And then your Informatica job blows up in the middle of the night. And now
right.
everybody's screaming the next morning because the data hasn't been refreshed. You told us that would be refreshed overnight and it's not been refreshed. What happened? You changed the source. They changed the source system, didn't tell us. Now we got to go back and re-engineer the ETL and
Oh,
change the tables in the database. And yeah, so much of that
brutal.
went away in the last, well, see, Snowflake was founded in 2012. So the last 10 years, I started with them in 2015. So it's been less than a decade. And, they solved those really big problems that we had in data warehousing for multiple decades.
Well, I mean, you kind of hinted at the big downside of the old way, which is basically an opportunity cost around innovation. Because it was fragile, because it was difficult to work with, because changes were very hard, people didn't try to make changes. I mean, it's like a kid who keeps getting reprimanded for trying new things. They just stop. They're like, fine, I won't do anything, right? So the psychology of data use really took a whole new turn in large part thanks to Snowflake. Now, of course, we have Databricks, we have a whole bunch of other options of ways to do things. But the point is that now there is more confidence to move forward, to try changes, to do things because you're not so worried about bringing the whole thing to a crashing halt, right?
Right. You're not creating instant technical debt by doing something,
Hmm.
right? And so you
Hmm.
can take a more agile approach. You can be more responsive to the business, right? And the business requirements when they want to change without having to worry that, oh yeah, we're gonna break it. And then the tools have evolved so much too, between the data catalogs and the data engineering tools. The thing that we always needed was really good impact analysis reports. But to get the impact analysis reports, you needed something tracking the metadata around data lineage. You had to know where did that data come from and where did it go. If we pulled a data element in from one source system, how many places did it go? And if we change that, how many things is it going to impact? Well, you got to
Right,
have the lineage to do the
right.
impact analysis. And now we've got a lot more tools in ER, what we call our modern data stack, that allow us to do that so much easier, so much quicker. You're no longer relying on a couple of data engineers to know the code inside and out and go, oh yeah, that's right. I remember over in that routine we did this and we did this based on the user requirements, but then they had us do this in a different routine. And yeah, if we touch that, we're going to break three different things. You
Right.
don't have to do that anymore. You can find it through the metadata.
Yeah. Well, and you hinted at something else, and I threw out the large language models to start us off here.
Yeah.
And you think about the impact of these engines. Now, I think there are numerous other shoes left to drop in this equation. Just one way of putting it, basically, because they are very powerful. But Sam Altman had that very curious comment he made a couple months ago, saying, "Oh, the era of large language models is over." And everyone was like,
What?
"What? Like, what are you talking about?" I think now I don't know, this is just my personal theory, but we've now seen that they've had some challenges. People, and this is research that I've done and people I've talked to, have said there are things that it did very well 3 months ago, 4 months ago, that now it has a hard time doing. A good buddy of mine who actually almost worked with OpenAI said that he looked at their models 3 years ago or so and said, you're going to have all kind of problems because you're not respecting entropy. He said you're going to have short-term memory problems, long-term memory problems. Basically, he blew it up at them, and they just said, all right, well, get out of here. We're going to do it our way.
We'll
And
deal with that later.
yeah, we'll do it exactly. We'll figure that out later. And of course, they rolled out, and that's huge. I mean, the friends I have at Google, I can tell they are stressed out. The company is very stressed out right now, which is kind of hard to believe because it's Google. Like, I mean, goodness, you're one of the biggest companies in the world. You changed the world with the stuff that you did. And of course, what happened? Microsoft throws a whole bunch of money at OpenAI. Then the OpenAI board curiously kicks him out, and then Satya Nadella hires him. And like, wow, that was one of the biggest like tennis matches I've ever seen. Like, what is it? What? Like, it's going back and forth. Point being, and where I'm kind of going with all this is, even though there are some challenges, they're so powerful. You can load code in it and ask the machine to tell you what the code means. You can load a whole bunch of documents and ask it to summarize. I think those are the two better use cases. But kind of where I'm going is, I see these LLMs, the engines of them at least, and maybe it's SLMs, small language models, that become more prominent, really serving as a very powerful component in a workflow. So
Yes.
they're good at ETL, for example. I scraped a whole bunch of data off the CES website because I wanted to get a clean list of companies from that site. So I did a just Command A, Command C, Command V into a Google Doc, and then I pasted that into Gemini, was Bard back then, and I said, please give me a clean list of just the company names and all this text. And there's all this other text inside. And it was like, okay, just banged it out. I'm like, all right, that's pretty impressive, that it can take an instruction like that, ascertain I only want company names, know what those are in the context, and then bang out a whole list. And then I asked it to give me a Twitter handle for each one. It did that too, but half of them were bad. So it does make stuff up. But nonetheless, I mean, think about if you'd seen this blob of text, you know what I'm talking about. Just all kinds of other words in between places and tabs and commas and just all kind of crap. I had no problem just stripping all that stuff out. That's a very powerful function, which would have taken a good ETL developer, I don't even know how long, to sort through it and figure out. It would be hard to do, not for the LLMs. So, what kind of impact do you think they're going to have on the data management business writ large?
Well, I think that what we're seeing is the next step in data democratization,
Hmm.
right? By we can now, with even what you described, you took the data engineer out of the loop, right? You were able to do something very quickly on your own. And I think that's, part of the promise and the power of these things is to allow, business analysts now to do things
Hmm.
with data without having to be coders, right? They don't even necessarily need to know SQL. One of the recent demos I saw, I think it's called Cortex, one of
Yeah,
the new
I know
Snowflake
Cortex.
features,
I
right?
know this
It's
program.
like
Yeah.
you can ask a question, say, I want the the average sales over the last 3 years for my top 5 regions, and it writes the SQL for you, right? And that's starting to come out. And I've seen a couple demos like that recently, from the data analytics perspective. That now, again, you don't have to know SQL. You don't even necessarily have to understand the schema of the database in order to get some basic analytics done using an
Right.
LLM, using it's prompt. My son is in school now, and he mentioned something about one of the careers that they've talked about in the career education stuff that he's going through at college was a thing called prompt engineering,
Hmm.
right? That
Yeah,
you could take classes in prompt engineering. It's like, well, what does that mean? That's okay. How to ask the question,
that's
right?
right.
So I think we used to call that critical thinking, right? Is learning how to ask the question, but now you're going to learn how to ask the question of an AI, basically,
Right.
and how you ask the question will have an effect on the outcome because again, the AI, the LLM can't read your mind and it can
Right.
only interpret so much. So being able to ask very clear, concise questions using language that the AI recognizes is going to be the skill, right? That's going to be the skill rather than knowing how to write select sum, count, star,
Right.
group by,
Right.
right, in order to get it, in order to get the answer.
Which is so huge because, and this is leading up to maybe segment two. I'm going to give you one of my big ideas and see what you think about it. But because now you've democratized access to analytics, is what you've done. So
Right.
basically, you had to know some SQL or have a good idea at least how to use the technologies to be able to build the queries. Now you just ask it a question. Now, again, it does make things up, so you have to be careful. You have to vet things, but we've always had to vet things. I mean, there are times when the data engineering was done wrong. So it's not like humans didn't make mistakes and now the AI is creating some net new function called a mistake. No, like it makes stuff up and it has some problems. But the fact that you can sit there and just have such an interactive discourse with the data, to me, is incredibly game changing. And I think it's going to put even more excitement in the workplace to use the data, because a lot of times people don't use the technologies because they're hard to use, because they're slow, because they don't trust the data, for example. Now we do have the trust issue, but this stuff is not hard to use. I mean, it can be hard to get really good at your prompt engineering, but even then, just ask it a different question. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't get annoyed at you. I will admit, I tried Grok a little bit. I thought Grok was kind of annoying. That's the one that's in Twitter these days. It's supposed to be sarcastic and goofy, and I'm like, is there a big market for an engine that gives me sarcastic answers? I just don't think so. I think maybe Elon smoked a couple doobies before that one came out, which is fine. I mean, the guy's done amazing things. He's an engineer himself, and you look at the accomplishments this guy's had. It's just absolutely shocking. But you do have competition out there, and I guess what I'm driving at is by democratizing access to systems of record with these LLMs, we are fundamentally changing the game about how people interact with data, how they're able to consume data, learn from data. I'm writing an abstract right now, in fact, for the show I'll do with you on Thursday, all about this concept of data literacy. And I think that just playing around with these tools connected to your data sources, you are fostering better data literacy because you're learning things about the data. And you don't have to take a class necessarily. You just have to dedicate the time to hop online, play around, click a few buttons, type in some questions, and see the different answers. And you have to work with it to see how it operates and to kind of know sort of the contours of what it does. But folks, don't touch that dial. I'll be right back in a moment. We're talking to a hero of data, Kent Graziano. We'll be right back. All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis with Kent Graziano, who has been a data avenger for years, quite frankly. You've been out there on the front lines. I remember I met you at the Data Vault conference a number of years ago. That was
Hmm.
fun. That was before the big COVID. And, COVID gave us a lot of time to think about stuff for sure and to sort of reevaluate what was going on. I'm sure there's a bit of a COVID surge in terms of innovation because people don't have time to think about stuff and do cool new things. And with that in mind, I'm going to throw my big idea over to the sage Graziano. I want to get your thoughts on this. So I keep thinking about how executives use data and how we've used data historically, and that there are these long processes of building reports and doing all these different things. I think the LLMs kind of turn all that on its head, and if you do it right, I think what's going to happen is companies are going to get their own, ideal to get their own private model. Maybe it's a small language model for a particular
Yeah.
industry like legal or healthcare or retail because they have their own lexicon. And so it's good to kind of weed out the semantic issues that you'll find with a large language model. That's kind of the point of the small language models. So you get that, and then you get your vector database, you basically take your curated, trusted data and you start feeding it into the vector database as your embeddings. These are your anchors of truth. And what I think is going to happen is this is sort of the Valhalla vision, if you will, is that you get enough of your corporate data in your embeddings. You've got your anchors of truth now, and then you set up whether it's Kafka topics or some kind of stream of changes coming through, like CDC, basically into the vector database. And then what's going to happen is the executives are just going to sit there and have this amazing intern with tremendous amounts of knowledge at their fingertips. They'll be able to ask any number of questions. How are we doing this month? What can I do to change? Who's really excelling in my sales team? Like all these kind of questions that you can just ask and just get information pouring into them. And it's going to be very useful because it's connected to your data warehouse, to your CRM system, to your Salesforce, to your clickstream analysis, whatever it is that you've got. That senior executive is tapped into it and can now ask any question he or she wants. How viable is that, do you think? And is that the future?
Yeah, I think you've hit on something there, because really this is, the extension, evolution, maybe it's um, the fruition of all the ideas that we had around data warehousing and decision support systems and advanced analytics and business intelligence in general, right? That to have that at the fingertips of an executive, that's where the value comes in, right? Is you've got to be able to use the data to make effective business decisions. And I think that what you're describing could be the differentiator that allows an organization to get their competitive advantage. And
Mhm.
specifically when they're looking at their internal data, right? And training a model on their data. If they do that right, that's the thing that's going to give them the competitive advantage, because so many things have been commoditized, right? And yeah, we've got lots of data out there that's being shared via data marketplaces. And sure, you're probably going to want to pull some of that in, but it's the combination of that external data with your internal data, your
Right.
proprietary data, that's the thing that's got to give you the competitive advantage. And if you've got, like you said, this basically online, on demand executive intern, data intern that's putting all this together automagically, right?
Hmm.
Through a small language model, that the executive got a question, they just, like Alexa, they'll probably they'll have to give it their own name and say, hey, I heard from my sales guy that we're having a problem in the Western region. Um, give me a summary of what happened in sales in the last 3 days in the West region. And boom, it's like, and eventually it should be able to give us, well, what's the implication of that? Oh,
Right.
the trend is, if what's happening in sales in the West region continues for X number of more weeks, you're going to lose this much profit,
Right.
right?
I mean, these are the kinds of questions that we built data warehouses to answer.
Yes,
Is kind of where I'm going with this. And it's like
absolutely.
I don't think the data warehouse is going to go away, but it's to me, it has to get simpler, I think. And, so you look at the marketplace, what happened? Databricks went out and bought Mosaic ML for like 1.4 billion or something like that when this was just taking off. And Teradata and some of the others were still kind of laughing at the Gen AI stuff, which I thought was a bit foolish, frankly. But
Well,
what are you
those
going to
guys
do?
were laughing at the cloud originally too, if you remember.
Yeah, well, that's right. That's pretty funny.
They didn't work out
Right.
either.
Right. Well, I don't know, man. Like, I keep thinking about the disruptive power of these engines. And again, yes, they get some stuff wrong. So do the old systems. The old systems got stuff wrong because their data was wrong, or the model was wrong, or
And
the
it takes
ETL
even longer to
failed.
find it and fix it in the old systems.
Well,
That's the
that's the other
difference.
thing. Right, that's the other thing. So it's like, here's what fascinates me is try to figure out how do these models figure out what to choose when they give you their answer. Now, Kindy that got bought by Click, I took a demo of their engine. It's pretty interesting because it connects to an LLM and basically you use it for like frequently asked questions for your manual for some new product that you bought, like the new iPhone or something, and you load the whole thing in there, it'll automatically give you frequently asked questions that it suggests and the answers, and you curate that. And then when someone uses it, you'll get the answer you asked, but they'll give you a drop down that'll show you where it got those bits from. So it'll say
Hmm.
the first sentence came from page 3, paragraph 2, the other one came from here. I'm like, now that is compelling because
Because now
now
you're
it's
getting the
showing you,
annotation, right? That's the annotation that
which
we
is
were taught in our language classes, right? In our English classes, learning how to do research papers. It's like, don't put anything in there that you can't prove where it came from, right? And
right.
whether it's endnotes or footnotes, all those annotations are there, and that's part of what we need. That's, I guess, the part of the QA on these things is,
Hmm.
can we
Hmm.
can we see where this data came from, rather than it, even though it might be a black box that generated the result, it's still traceable to the source and
Right.
say, these are the references. This is where these numbers came from. This is where this concept came from. This is how we're coming up with this particular recommendation. And I think that's
Hmm.
critical. That is
Yeah.
critical, to differentiate between a hallucination and a good answer that you actually want to run your business off of.
Right. Well, and that's the thing, right? Is that to run your business off these things, you're going to have some certitude about what they're telling you. So that is a concern. But I feel like there's going to be downward pressure on pricing for data warehousing. But at the same time, you've got so much automation now. It's so much easier to do things than it was in the old days. I mean, I guess that one of the biggest hurdles to overcome here is just old-fashioned mindsets. What do you think?
Absolutely. Oh yeah. I mean, that's the even when I started off with Snowflake, the most frequent question or actually comment I got when I was out, being the evangelist and talking to people about the separation of compute from storage and zero copy cloning and all the things that we talked about. And the first thing is like, oh, that'd be awesome if it was true. And then they say, okay, well, how do we index our queries? It's like you don't. Well, then this thing can't work. It can't work.
Right.
There's no way it can work because you don't have indexes. It's like, no, this is a completely different architecture. And it was getting that mindset change. Same thing when we went from waterfall to agile, right?
Hmm.
Trying to think about how do we do a project in iterations versus spending 6 months writing up the requirements document, getting everybody signed off, and then spending 2 years building it, or spending a year and a half doing an enterprise data model, and then having to hand it to a DBA to convert it to a schema in a database. And 3 years
Right.
later, you've got a data warehouse that has nothing in it because nobody cares anymore, right? We had to change the way
That's pretty
people were
funny.
thinking. And I think what we're talking about here, it's the same thing. It's we've talked over the last couple of years about companies, about data literacy and data culture, and it really is the organizational culture and expectations that you've got to find a way to shift those, right? And get out of the classic, and this is every industry. It's not just IT. It is every industry. Well, we've never done it that way before. Or the reverse. Well, we've always done it this way, and I'm
Right.
comfortable doing it this way.
Right.
So I want to just keep going this way. And I actually early on in Snowflake, we worked with a large retailer in England, and they, after their evaluation, decided to switch from one of the existing big data warehouse companies to Snowflake. And several DBAs literally resigned and went and found other jobs. And this is in Europe where, people don't change jobs hardly at all because
Right.
they didn't want to spend the last 5 years of their career learning Snowflake. They wanted to stay with what they were comfortable with, which was the older system. And they found another company in London that needed a DBA that had their expertise, and they figured they were going to go over there and sail off into the sunset, that was going to be less stressful for them than to stay where they were and learn this really exciting new technology, that they
Right.
literally left the organization rather than change the way they were doing things and thinking about
Wow.
things differently.
Yeah. That's not
I was
uncommon,
I
you
was
know.
floored.
Yeah.
I was like, they did what?
Like, that's it.
Okay.
I'm done. I'm out.
I'm out.
No,
Yeah.
thank you. That's wild. I mean, and that's I feel like that's where we are right now because of these LLMs. I mean, so much is being shaken at the moment, and people still have to do their jobs. They still have to get stuff done. I mean, I've played around with these things, and I'm really amazed at what they're able to capture, even though they do hallucinate, even though they do make things up. It's really impressive what they can find, and you just have to sit there and wonder, wow, all of this stuff is embedded in these models and it's just deep in there. It's going to take us years to find out what's in there because there's so much stuff in there already, right? I mean, like, how do you begin?
Yeah, and like everything, is you got to start, yeah, one foot in front of the other, but you got
Right.
to be willing to try, and
Right.
I think that's the big lesson in all of this, and certainly even the last 10 years with the going from Hadoop to cloud data warehouses like Snowflake and then Databricks is you've got to be willing to take a look at these new technologies and think about it critically as like, how can I take advantage of this technology rather than go, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job, right? They're
Right.
not going to need me anymore. It's like, well, yeah, they're not going to need you anymore if you don't learn how to do new things. If you
Right.
don't
No,
learn
that's
how to
right.
use these new technologies, figure out how to apply yourself to the new technology with the knowledge that you already have.
Hmm.
Whether it's, in the data world, we're talking about data management. You understand things like schemas and SQL and all that. Well, how can you apply that in the LLM world and the SLM world? How can you
Hmm.
be of value to your organization, helping them make these transitions to the newer technologies and for the advantage of the organization?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, you mentioned earlier your schema on read. And now with these LLMs, it's almost like you can do that to a certain extent, right? And then schema
but
on
but not in the way that any of the NoSQL people ever dreamed of, right? Right. Is that
right,
we now have an AI that can read the schema,
right,
right? That somebody doesn't have to look at the ER diagram and know how to write the joins. Now, the downside, I guess the caveat in all of this, and you mentioned it kind of in one of your earlier statements about having your data warehouses and all that, is this presumes you've got a good, a well-structured data architecture,
hmm,
that there's metadata at least that tells you how the data is related and what the data
right,
means, the
right,
semantics of the data. You talked about, having the lexicon of, say, a law firm. You got that
hmm,
terminology there. Well, the underlying data, there's got to be a relationship there between that um, legalese and the data in order to be able to ask a question and create a prompt that will get you the answer you want. And so
right,
it presumes that it's your data is structured, that it's documented, and that it's high quality, right? Because the LLM is not going to discriminate between a bad row of data and good row of data unless you somehow programmed it to say, ignore all the rows where data is null, right? So you've put a data quality check into the prompt
right,
itself, right? I know
right,
I don't want to do analysis on things where the sales date is blank, right? Because obviously
right,
I've got a problem.
right,
But you would have to know enough about data quality and know enough about the data to ask a question that way. So otherwise, you got to somewhere somebody has to still do, the hard part that we've always done there with building that data platform and ingesting the data and curating the data. I think you use that word curate, this
hmm.
curated um,
Yeah,
data that
I
we're going to
think
use to feed all these things.
right, and I think that's going to be the next big push is figuring out these pipelines to feed the LLMs. So you have to get your sort of foundation in place, but then it's going to be updating these things and then monitoring over time. Well, folks, don't touch that. I'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis. All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, talking to the one, the only Kent Graziano is going to be at Data Universe April 10th and 11th in New York City, at the Javits Center. Don't miss it, folks. It's going to be fun. Yours truly will be there. And I'll throw one of my other curveballs at you, Kent, just because you're such a good guy and I know you can hit good curveballs. What I'm going to talk about, one of my talks is the death of journalism, as I call it. And what I'm really referring to is the fact that there's no media company who can stand up to these large language models and the power of this AI in terms of personalization, in terms of covering everything that could be interesting to someone. And I think what's going to happen here is that the smart media companies are going to figure out how to do what we mentioned. They're going to get their own model. They're going to train their model on their voice by loading all the past articles as embeddings. And then what's going to happen is journalists are going to be more like curators and editors, and you're going to be spinning
Hmm.
out stories from facts. You have to have your fact sets. This is really, really important fact sets, and that's systems of record. So I think like sales tax systems, for example, I think a municipality has to collect sales tax. They're collecting all this data from all the different stores, and you determine what products were sold. Most have barcodes, so you can be able to do some analysis. Wouldn't that be a fantastic service to subscribe to as a business person? Let's say I run a small, like an Easy Mart or something like that, to be able to see who's buying what. And the example I give is Squishmallows. Like one day you're just looking at your report, like, what are these Squishmallow things that everyone's making tons of money on? look into this. Oh, there's some new toy for kids that kids freaking love. So now kids have to have every Squishmallow under the sun,
It's
and
the
everyone's
it's the
making
it's the new Beanie Babies.
it is. It's a new that's exactly what it is. It's new it's the new Beanie Baby with lots of different sizes. My point is that it's not going to be so much individual reporters going out spending all day writing something as it's going to be dynamically generated bits of information from systems of record spoken in text that is from a large language model that can be altered because now like it's like having a reporter that you can ask questions of all day long. No, wait a minute. Tell me more about this. Tell me more about that. No reporter can sit there and answer questions for everyone all day long. You just can't do it. So I think there's going to be a whole movement of data engineering around media, of connecting to these large language models, and you'll still have reporters and journalists who will sort of review this stuff and write some of their own original content for their voice. But to me, there's no stopping this train. It's like a high-speed train coming at all of us. What do you think?
Well, my one question there is like, but where? How do we collect the facts that go into generating these stories?
Hmm.
Yeah, I
Hmm.
like the idea of being able to ask the questions. And, right now we got all kinds of clickbait headlines, and it's like you want to ask the question, you read the article, and it doesn't quite tell you. It's like, well,
Right.
where, what was the vaccination rate in New York State between March
Right.
2021 and April
Right.
2022?
Right.
Broken down by county. And you might want to get that detail because you live in a particular county in New York. You want to see, well, what really happened? The headline says vaccination rates dropped 50% over what it was pre-COVID or something like that. And you want to get the details, but the article doesn't quite cover it, but you want to ask those questions. But
Right.
again, back to what's the source of the data though? Where's that
Right.
information going to come from? Um, if you don't have, you still have to have, I think, the reporters in the field. Somebody has to go out and interview people somehow. And it might be via Zoom like this, right? That you find,
Mm-hmm.
hey, here's a person who has information about something that just happened. And so we get them on a Zoom call and we talk to them. And then the Zoom AI transcribes that conversation, so nobody's actually having to type it all up, right?
Right.
And then that could be a source, I guess, for the LLM. But somewhere there's still got to be that interaction with the external world somehow.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's going to be these systems of record. So taxes is one because every county collects taxes. There are other sources for government, like the Federal Register, for example, wherever actions are taken. So think like your ERP system, basically, that's
Yeah.
tracking the movement of goods and the sales and all this kind of stuff. Salesforce, that's what I was mentioning. You want to tap into all these different systems and get a feed from them to be able to ask questions of your business. And so of the government, you could do the same thing. And I just think about, how much there is to be gleaned from these environments of ours. And you think about even policy documents, right? A buddy of mine, Jim Harris, was saying he was talking to a friend who works for, I think, a Canadian government organization, and he was like, "Oh man, I need to fire this person. How can I do that? I don't know what the paperwork is going to look like." And he said, "Just ask an LLM." And it's like, okay, he asked, and it's like, okay, step one, you have to file a letter of grievance and say, hey, your job is not performing well, et cetera. Step two is to wait 2 weeks. Step three is do this and all these things. Like, because if you fed all this documentation into a large language model, it
Right.
can give you a good summary. And so I mean, wow. Think about like in the court system, how you have all these different motions you can file and you have to found the motion on something based on this, based on that. Case law, for example. I mean, there are these stories of an attorney who just used whatever the LLM gave him and got in trouble. I almost think that's
Because it
fun.
made up case law. Yeah, it actually
Yeah, it
referenced
and it
precedents
did.
that didn't exist.
Right, and that's a problem, right? But a small language model that's trained on all the case
Right.
law is going to be a very different story. So, and now you can check things, and I mean, you can even work that into the workflow to say, as your RAG model, check and make sure that these are actual cases at the. So again, that gets back to the workflow stuff.
Hmm.
Well, that, I mean, we've paid lawyers hundreds, even thousands of dollars an hour sometimes to know the nuances of these codes and these policies. Well, that, you don't have to do that anymore. To me, that's just a huge change. I think about just your manual, like your code of conduct or something for these big companies. They'll have like big thick, or even the laws that they're passing these days, 1,000 pages. Oh, we can't. There was a famous politician who said, "Oh, what's the point of reading it if you don't have 2 days and two lawyers?" Well, now you can. Now you can just feed that sucker until LLM and ask it all kind of questions. What are the strangest things in here? What's the most expensive? What's the least expensive? Point being, that is a massive game changer for day-to-day workflow. And it's not just text generation, it's not just image generation. I mean, those are two categories of use case. But to me, the analytical side is the most interesting because it does have all these different ways of looking at things because of all the parameters, right?
Yeah, no, I think you're not wrong on that. I'm still thinking about the journalism experience
Yeah,
example though as to how that's going to work. Like I could see the other end of it, but I still say you have a sourcing issue. You still got to have the
hmm
humans involved somehow to get the
hmm
basic information for it. Though
Sure.
I guess these days you could I guess you could scrape everything off of Twitter because there's we talked about citizen data scientists in the past here with democratizing data. We've got
Right,
citizen journalists out there. Unfortunately, you don't know necessarily how accurate the reporting is, but I guess if you have something
right,
happening in the world and you've got 20 or 30 Twitter feeds that are reporting it, that are not just reposting what somebody else posted, but are actually taking pictures themselves. And now we've got AIs that are now able to start doing things like analyze
right.
pictures, right? And say
Well,
what's in
and
that
that,
picture. Say
right,
these five posts all have pictures supposedly of this event, and it should
right,
be able to overlay them and go, yeah, those pictures, they're unique pictures, but they are of the same area. And you get the kind of the landscaping overlay of this line here that, yep, that's that same building in the background, and be able to
right.
verify all of that.
Right. Well, that is a very, very interesting point. And so, kind of to that end, I thought of this a while ago, and you know, cameras, all these digital cameras, they have their own metadata,
Yep.
right? They have some of them have GPS, so they know where you are, they know what time of day you took the picture. They have this metadata. I'm sure that's encoded in the file, like we talked about Parquet files, right? It's got the metadata baked in there, so you can vet and see, aha, this one was doctored, that one wasn't. But to your point, you could aggregate on demand when there's a big event, like when there's a riot someplace, or when there's a smash and grab or something, to be able to dynamically pick up little bits and pieces of that. I could see an AI engine writing a story. There was a row at Bob's bar last night, and 27 people were involved. Like you could get some juicy details, and Bob Jones was taken to jail because you get his mugshot or something. I mean, it is possible, but to your point, you have to have some source. So Twitter becomes a source, social media becomes a source, official records like police reports and things of that nature become sources. I
Well,
mean, I
and
think what's going to
and
happen.
those things have to
Go,
be accessible. That's
right,
that's the other thing,
right.
that the whole data
That's
sharing
right,
thing, whether it's
right,
a government source,
right.
economics data you were talking about, the tax data you were talking about, it has to be accessible somewhere so
That's right.
that the LLM can get to the data, or you could build a data pipeline to pull it in.
That's right. No, that's exactly correct. And I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on those systems because when this stuff starts to take off, I mean, apparently that's why Elon instituted that rate limiting stuff for a period of time because they realized that someone was sucking all their data out and using it to train other models because here it was a free source and you could use it. So he was trying to stop that. It's just crazy the things we're dealing with these days. But don't touch that. The podcast bonus segment is up next. We'll be right back. All right, folks, time for the podcast bonus segment here on a fantastic inside analysis with our profiles in data sage, Kent Graziano. We'll be talking all about the Data Universe conference coming up. It's the April 10th and 11th dates, just a few weeks away now. Kent will do a fireside chat with yours truly about privacy, which of course conjures up images of governance and security and data management and ethics and all that fun stuff. And there's also the Data Vault conference coming up in the beginning of May. Is that right, Kent?
Yeah, yeah. WWDVC is going to be the 10th anniversary.
Time
of
flies when
that.
you're having
Yeah.
fun,
Oh
and
yeah.
even when
Yeah.
you're not.
In Stowe, Vermont. It's beautiful, beautiful location.
It
A
is
little harder
beautiful
to
up
get
there.
to than New York City, but but it's worth it. It's worth it to get there.
Well, it's funny. Speaking of getting there, we drove when you and I met there, which was like I guess it was the year before COVID, 2019 maybe.
2019, yeah.
And we drove, and you know, higher forces were watching out for us because I'm trying to look at this map, like trying to understand what this is, like the straight thing, and we realize oh, it's a ferry. Like we better get that ferry and we were there just in time to get the last one and get across.
The
It's just
repair
like
across
oh,
the southern end of Lake Champlain. Yeah.
I guess so because we would have had to drive all the way around. It would have been a really
You'll be
unpleasant
glad to know there's a
experience.
bridge there now.
Is there? Okay, that's
There
good.
is a bridge. It's a windy drive through the countryside there in the far east border of New York State, the very southern end of Lake Champlain. But there's actually a bridge that goes over now, so you don't have to wait for a ferry. There's actually a
Nice.
real bridge that got put in there. I must have been during COVID because when I went after COVID and drove, I was like, oh hey, this is great. And
There it is.
I used Google Maps, and I was just following the map going, it looks like there's a bridge on the map. It's like, okay, I'll go that way. Sure
That's
enough, and it
funny.
goes into southern Vermont.
Well, and it's funny because, in terms of following bots and just doing what the bot tells you, I heard someone give a real good example and say you're already doing it when you use your maps feature on your phone. You're just
Absolutely.
trusting what it tells you to do and like, oh, here we go. And I think that is going to be a very interesting other change in our industry is these little AI agents doing little things, just scanning around, looking for stuff. I mean, you and I are going to talk about privacy, and of course, that again brings governance into the picture and ethics. What you should do ethically. I think that there are all these conversations happening now because we need them now. Because guess what? This is a big deal, and I'll tell you one of my other big visions here is these companies like Amazon and Google and Facebook and LinkedIn and others have done very well by using our data to train their algorithms, which of course they then use, they say, to give us better stuff. I've never yet bought the argument I'm going to get better advertising. Like, I don't think I've
I
seen the
don't
better
want any
advertising.
advertising.
Exactly. It's like, really, is that's the carrot at the end of the stick here is I give up all my data and then I know that you're going to give me good things that ad people are trying to sell me and like I don't just I haven't seen that. But I will say there is some cool stuff on, some cool gadgets these days. So I've come across some of those on Facebook and some other places. So there is some benefit to it. But I want to be able to own our algorithm. Like everyone talks about being able to own your data and get some money, like secondary income. I mean, I think that the numbers aren't quite there to really make that interesting. Like, how much data will it be? Is it like how much Spotify pays small bands? I hear people joke, yeah, I got my check for $1.49 in the mail. And how exciting is that? There is this scale problem, but I do feel like still all the power is centralized with these big organizations. And I'd love to find some way to kind of pull that out and get some more power back in the individual's hands or even in aggregate. Like I wrote about what I referred to as a consumer facing data lake of information about transactions. So you think credit card companies sell their exhaust data to investment banks so they can optimize what they buy on the stock market and other reasons like that. Well, I think when they sell our data to some third party like that, they should also provide an anonymized version for this consumer data lake where you and I and anyone else could kind of log in and just see interesting data about what's happening in the world. How many apples are being sold? How many cars are being sold? That's interesting information for business people. And this kind of gets back to the journalism thing because especially for business people, what I want more than anything is information. I don't really want
Right.
attitude or spin or narrative or all that stuff. What I want is facts about what are people paying for this? What are people paying for that? How long does it take this company to do that job? How long does it take that company to do this job? That's really useful information. And it's just facts. It's just
Yeah.
basic facts that come from transactional systems. So that's my big vision for the future. But what do you think about that?
Oh yeah, I'm with you because Dan Linstead, who invented Data Vault, he he used to say Data Vault is a historical repository of the facts from your
Hmm.
source system. It's not a single source of truth; it's a single source of facts because truth becomes malleable to a certain extent with your
Wow.
interpretation, right?
Right.
But to create the information, for it to be information and to be informative, it has to be based on facts. So you've got to start, you got to set that foundation, right? And
Right.
so having a we don't have to have a single source of facts like we used to. That was our goal with data warehousing, was the single source of truth. The technologies have evolved. Not everything has to necessarily be in the data warehouse, provided you've got the data pipelines and the right business use cases for it. But you do have to have a source of fact in
Mm-hmm.
order to do this, because you don't want guesswork going on.
Mm-hmm.
Unless of course you're dealing with um, customer sentiment, which is different. But then even that, getting customer sentiment off of, say, off of X or Facebook or LinkedIn by people posting about your product, those are facts. This customer said this,
Right.
right? And from that fact and a lot of other similar facts, you can start to evolve then an understanding of customer sentiment about your product.
Right. Right. That's so cool. I love that. A single source of facts. It makes a lot of sense because, and I'll throw one last teaser out here. I came across a stat as I was preparing for my talk on the death of journalism. And the biggest challenges are bias. Quite frankly, there's bias. Oh, there's also something you might like. There's misinformation, there's disinformation, and there's missed information. And to
Well,
me, that's the biggest one. Go ahead.
I'll give you another one. Poisoned information.
Poisoned.
Inf
Oh,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Dan alerted me to that one. There's been a couple articles about that, about poison data. Where
Oh,
so it's, think of it as reverse hacking. Instead of somebody hacking into your system and stealing your data, they hack into your
right.
system and inject bad data so that your algorithms come out with the wrong answer.
Wow. That's crazy.
Isn't that
Wow.
crazy?
That is
Yeah.
crazy. Well, it's been so much fun talking to you, Kent. You're such a rock star in the industry. I've always looked to you for advice on what's happening. I look forward to seeing you in New York in just a couple of weeks. Folks, hop online to Data Universe, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. You've been listening to Inside Analysis.